Hola, buenas tardes a todos. Muchísimas gracias por estar aquí en Miércoles FA. En esta ocasión tan especial que tenemos de invitado a Allan Shulman. Varios me han preguntado que si es pariente de Julius Shulman. Aparentemente no lo es. I'm telling you. Entonces es muy interesante lo que vamos a escuchar ahora, porque es una mirada de América Latina desde el exterior. Una mirada con menos prejuicios, una lectura con menos prejuicios de los que solemos tener nosotros los latinoamericanos justamente por ser de aquí. En ese sentido creo que va a ser bastante ilustrativo lo que nos van a mostrar hoy. No solo vamos a hablar de México, vamos a hablar de esta multinacional, Bacardi, que todos conocen, cubana, de Santiago de Cuba, que es parte de la identidad latinoamericana internacional, no solo comercial, sino también cultural, artística y política. Entonces, gracias a las investigaciones de Allan, podemos tener una especie de mosaico de lo que ha sido, en alguna medida, Latinoamérica, no solamente México, sino América Latina, a través de la interpretación de la arquitectura y el arte y más cosas, de esta compañía y cómo ha impactado en la construcción de nuestras identidades y en el territorio construido finalmente. Bueno, les voy a decir brevemente quién es Allan Shulman. Él es el director de los programas de posgrado en arquitectura y es profesor asociado en la Universidad de Miami, en la Escuela de Arquitectura. Fundó el despacho, basado en investigación arquitectónica, Shulman y Asociados, en 1996. El trabajo ha recibido premios y ha sido reconocido con más o menos 70 premios de diseño, y Shulman recibió la medalla por el diseño en 2010, la medalla de plata del Instituto Americano de Arquitectos. Shulman también es un autor, es un editor, es un curador, es conferencista. Su exhibición, La disciplina de la naturaleza, Alfred Browning Parker, en Florida, justo se inauguró la semana pasada en el Museo de Historia de Miami, ¿no? El libro del que nos va a hablar hoy, por suerte, se llama Construyendo Bacardi, Arquitectura, Arte e Identidad, y es una edición de la reconocidísima editorial Rizzoli. Bueno, sin más, le damos la bienvenida a Allan.
Good afternoon. I apologize, I'm going to speak in English. I live in Miami, and my Spanish is probably not, I would embarrass myself if I spoke in Spanish, so I'm going to speak in English. First of all, I'd like to thank UNAM. I'm very honored to be here to present to you today. I'd also like to thank Professor Juan Ignacio del Cueto, Dino, who I first met 4 years ago when I was here doing research for this book and for the exhibition that preceded this book, and who graciously helped me find many materials and provided access to the archivo, the truly amazing archivos that you have here. And also to Salvador, whose work, along with Dino's work, precedes my own. So first of all, I should say that I know nothing about mixed drinks. I used to know nothing about mixed drinks. I'm not an expert in rum. People often ask, in this context, challenge me on the origins of the Cuba Libre formula or something. I don't know anything about these things. I do really love a good mojito. But Bacardi is a very important and relevant topic in general and for architects. Embedded in the combination of rum and family and company are important historical themes like the rise of the modern spirits industry, the interrelated roles of business and politics, the rise of the modern corporation, themes of transnational business and Pan-Americanism. It's a very Pan-American story, I think. Much has been written about Bacardi. just before I began this project was Tom Gelton's book, Bacardi and the Long Fight, which in many ways tracks the long history of Bacardi in Cuba and in the United States and around the Americas. But for me as an architect, what was really important was, first of all, its role in the history of corporate and industrial architecture, and even in the history of national architectures, because I think it played a very important role in those realms. But of central importance to my story is the role of Bacardi in storytelling, in its own storytelling, how it used architecture as a storytelling device, as a branding device. Because in every generation of the company, there has been an effort to work with architecture, to use architecture to identify the company, both in its original home in Santiago de Cuba, but also nationally and internationally. So this is quite important. It's a very poignant story, and I tried to tell the story in this book that I'm presenting as a story, not as architectural analysis or in other ways that architects often do. So what is the story? So I think it's important, when we think of Bacardi, when many people think of Bacardi, they may think immediately of the logo, of the bat, which is the company's most important branding device. But for more than 100 years, the company has used architecture, and perhaps many of you know of the work of Felix Candela and of Mies van der Rohe in this history. But what I tried to do is embed the story in a larger story, because the story of this sort of use of architecture goes back to the origins of the company, at least to the 20th century history of the company, and is a continuous story that involves many architects and many characters, not just the major names that we know about. I'd like to start because often, and I find this true in the city that I live in, Miami, where so much is built but almost nothing written, that sometimes the best way to begin to approach a topic is through ephemera or sort of popular culture, how it appeared in postcards and other media. And so I have a selection of postcards, and I think these postcards are important because they begin to show that the company understood or could communicate its own brand through allegories in the architecture. So for instance, in this first generation of industrial buildings, I think we can sort of read this idea of technical ingenuity and scientific know-how and industry, the prowess of industry. And the postcard on the left is one of Bacardi's first, perhaps it is the first advertising effort. It was a postcard printed after the Spanish-American War, after the completion of the Spanish-American War, specifically so that American soldiers could send letters home back to the States and by extension advertise Bacardi. And it's a very interesting series of postcards because it is not only about the company and its facilities, but in fact, in this postcard series, they identify all the landmarks of the city. And this becomes important because, for a long time, Bacardi was associated with Santiago de Cuba, its home. And Bacardi was Santiago, Santiago was Bacardi. But you can see a variety of other facilities here. In the 1920s and 30s, we see a kind of a different image emerging in these postcards. One of civic engagement, civic pride, political engagement. I'll just go through these very quickly. And in sort of the more modern period, progressivism, cultural authenticity, memory, and hybridity. And hybridity is a very important theme that I'll try to come back to. And then in all of this work, there is the role of memory, because Bacardi has developed its own architectural culture and constantly refers back to it. And one of the devices that I find most incredible in this regard are these type of surrealist assemblages of Bacardi buildings that happened in many forms, on letterheads, in advertisements, on postcards, which pull together these different buildings from different countries, from different styles, different architects, and assemble them like a family photo, like a very eclectic family photo. So just to begin with the story, and I tell the story in what I call 4 terrestrial paradigms, meaning how Bacardi placed itself, identified itself geographically. And the first one is regional, the second one is national, the third one is global or transnational, and the last one I would call global regional, and I'll come back to that theme. But in the first theme, I call it regional because at the origin of the company, it was really a regional industry based in Santiago de Cuba. It had, and the founder of the company, whose image you see there, is Facundo Bacardi. And Bacardi, really what he did to rum was to find a way to distill it to a very high quality, to create a kind of a consistent like a very civilized rum, more civilized than rum had been before. It begins a kind of a long romance with science, because in fact he arrived at the formula for the rum scientifically, and the formula for producing always the same rum was a scientific formula, and that we'll see how that plays out as Bacardi expands into other regions and other countries. But these 2 buildings on the right are Bacardi's first distilleries, and I think it's an interesting combination of images because on the one hand, it's Santiago intramuros and extramuros. In other words, the image on the right is inside the colonial city. It's a colonial structure, a Spanish colonial structure. The building on the left is outside the walls of the city, and it's a shed. And interestingly enough, although Bacardi's offices were in the first building, the building on the right, for almost 100 years, perhaps more than 100 years, the building on the left is the more beloved one. It's the one that is almost mythical in the history of Bacardi. And part of that myth has to do with the tree, which was planted by Facundo's son, and which always sort of formed a kind of a centering, a kind of identifying device for Bacardi. We'll see that tree come back again. This has been memorialized in many images, in bronzes, etc. This building, so it's an important structure. Well, soon the business was taken over by Emilio Bacardi, Facundo's son, who is the company's first president as the company modernizes into a corporation. And Emilio is a very interesting character because he's more than an industrialist. He's an industrialist. He's the mayor of the city during the American occupation, and starting in 1898. He's a writer, he's a historian, he's a man of letters, he's a cultural figure and an independence figure. And so he begins a sort of another idea for Bacardi, which I think is very tied to this idea of the city as a regional industry, that it is so associated with the region that it is kind of the patron of the region, and he becomes a figure larger than, and we'll see, it becomes a national figure. The buildings on the right are 2 buildings initiated under Emilio Bacardi. The one on the left is a new distillery built in 1915, which I think clearly shows the influence of the Pan American World's Fair in San Diego, the arts and industry buildings there, a very sort of modern industrial building, but with the cornice topped with these images of the bats, so always being extremely clear. about the nature of the industry. That palm tree that you see in the middle was the same one that was in front of the shed a moment ago. So that palm tree is memorialized in the center of the complex, very poignantly. And of course the water tower with the rum bottle at the top. And upon Emilio's death, his widow builds the first museum in Santiago. I think it's the first museum in Cuba, the Museo Emilio Bacardi. And it's an incredible facility that brings, he also contributed the collection. This is the photo on Inauguration Day. So in the 1920s and 1930s, there's a new idea of Bacardi that takes hold. Because Bacardi is expanding. It's no longer just the largest industry in Santiago, it's the largest industry in Cuba. It's a kind of a flagship industry for Cuba. There's a new president, Enrique Schweg, whose image you see there. It's interesting, this period of time corresponds to Prohibition in the United States. And if you don't know what Prohibition is, for about 20 years, alcohol was banned in the United States, the sale and distribution, consumption of alcohol, which basically meant that alcohol consumption expanded tremendously during that period. People drank more than ever, which grew Bacardi even more. But people came to Cuba to drink Bacardi rum, and Cuba became a prime tourist destination for Americans. And this postcard you see is the type of advertisement that would have inspired many Americans to say, let's go to a beautiful place where we can drink and be happy, get out of the glum prohibition conditions in the US. So the company expands tremendously during this period. It will end up building a headquarters in Havana, which we'll see, which will become sort of its new image, its new larger image. On the right is an advertisement I think is very evocative. It's celebrating the new American foreign policy called the Good Neighbors policy. And so Bacardi has also always connected to political themes, especially ones that connect north and south. And this one says the Americas agree on Bacardi, and we are good. The good neighbors are also good mixers. The project to build a new Bacardi building in Havana turned into a major competition. Schweg basically asked all the great architects of Havana during those years, all the major established architects to submit designs for it. The winners were two architects, Rodriguez Castells and Fernandez Ruenes. I'm not going to show all the submissions, but they're quite interesting because they show a kind of a modern corporate architecture, but one that also connects to, let's call it Spanish-American themes. So it's a steel building. It's not a skyscraper, but it's a commercial building. We could see buildings like this rising all over North America and Chicago and New York. And the motif of the building, as we'll see in a moment, is a kind of a tower over the center. And that motif had a kind of a Spanish Mediterranean design. But many of you may know that this same motif, this same Spanish Mediterranean motif can be found all over North America. And the city that I live in, Miami, has many buildings designed with this same tower, almost the same tower. So it's a very common, let's say, 1920s business, corporate North American theme. But here translated into a very important site, because at this moment, mid-1920s, the establishment of the Republic, the construction of new landmarks, a new capital for the country, the renovation of the Prado and the establishment of new parks right on the edge of the old historic colonial city, what was happening was that Bacardi was kind of locating itself in this absolutely prime spot between all of these things. And the building is an interesting building because it's not really a building for Bacardi. It's a building that only had a bar in it. Above it were offices for rent. Bacardi remained anchored in Santiago. It never moved its corporate headquarters. So this building was like a flag for the company. It was meant to show its engagement in the creation of the new republic, but also at the point of encounter of American tourism in Havana in the 1920s during Prohibition. And it's a beautiful building. It was originally designed in a Mediterranean revival style, but it was a period of great foment in architecture, and if you were to look at many other cities around the world, Art Deco was emerging as a sort of a modernism, and the building quickly adapts. Between the design and the construction, the building becomes an Art Deco building with these very interesting painted details. The sculptural figures and the coloring are rumored to have been created by the American pictorialist Maxfield Parrish. And this is another sub-theme, which is that the involvement of caricaturists, muralists, painters in the endeavor of creating these buildings and outfitting these buildings was quite extensive. The building on the inside is really designed to awe tourists walking in. It's a vestibule for the office building, but most importantly, it's a vestibule for the bar. And the bar, in the tradition of the American Prohibition, was not like a ground floor bar that opened to the street, but more of a speakeasy. I don't know if you are familiar with the idea of a speakeasy, but during Prohibition, bars were like in basements and in secret places. So it was a very secretive space. It was on the second floor, it was on the mezzanine. And basically you went through this series of salons that were just meant for your jaw to drop as you walked in and saw the marbles, the granites, the metalworks, the artwork. And then you would proceed up to this very intimate bar, and it became a kind of a must-see place. Another artist with whom the Bacardi family had a long association was Conrado Massaguer, Cuban editor of many journals, as well as an artist and caricaturist, and he created this poster that I think is very evocative because it is about the connection of Bacardi and Cuba. So this is why I say that in this moment, the company is a national industry, not a Santiago industry. It's a national flagship industry. On the right is the first result of the end of Prohibition in the United States, which is that all the spirits companies come rushing into New York to open headquarters, offices, showrooms. And Bacardi teams up with a company called Schenley, which was a whiskey provider. And Schenley buys a former social club, a beautiful grand building, one of the most beautiful buildings in New York. And on the ground floor installs the Bacardi bar. It's a very warm space. The architect Morris Sanders was an interior designer who perhaps worked in the kind of Art Deco syntax, but in this particular case worked with a muralist named Gropper to create a Cuban experience. The idea was to make you feel like you were in the tropics when you were here. And it's interesting because Gropper was a social realist. Most of the rest of his work was in support of the New Deal in the United States, the Franklin Delano Roosevelt programs. This was one of his few works for industry, for a corporation. And it's interesting that Bacardi chose to work with him. There was another Bacardi project in New York, which was the Bacardi Lounge, which was on the 36th floor of the Empire State Building. And it was a space outfitted with pieces of Cuba, basically, with ideas of Cuba. It had persianas along one wall. In fact, the windows out from the tower were screened by these persianas. It had mural by an artist named Gatorno, who was very involved in artistic movements of creating a kind of Cubanidad in Cuba, but who moved to New York to do this mural for Bacardi, and a fragment of the mural on the right. I like to oppose these two posters because I think it shows two very interesting faces of the company. On the left is an advertisement of the 1930s, late 1930s, which I think is meant to evoke Bacardi as pleasure, Bacardi as a good time, Bacardi as the tropics, the scent of the tropics, right, in the rum. And on the right is an advertisement from 1953, which associates the company, it's the centenary of Martí, José Martí, Cuban heroic figure. And then that's not the only sort of national association on this image, because at the bottom right you can see that the advertisement is not just for Bacardi, but it's also for Hatuey, which was their beer. And the name Hatuey is very evocative in Cuba because it's the name of a Native American who resisted the Spaniards, who was burnt at the stake for his resistance, and who was just a hero. So it's a kind of a hero tribute advertisement. So the two sides, this kind of serious political identification, and on the other hand, the fun. And those two work probably in the sense of interior-exterior. To the exterior, to the United States, for instance, it was fun, it was pleasure. To Cuba, it had a different meaning. The next phase of Bacardi's expansion begins with this man, José Pepín Bosch, who takes over in the 1940s. He's an interesting figure, a builder. He builds the company extraordinarily. Under Schweg, the company had already been expanding outside of Cuba. It had expanded to Mexico in the 1930s, and it had expanded right after Prohibition to Puerto Rico. And although these expansions and these sort of plants existed, these distilleries, it was the work of Bosch that really turned these into very important architectural works and enlarged them tremendously. Now Bosch, traveled incessantly, and from the 1950s, this is the Bacardi Plain, El Murciélago, and he basically moved around from facility to facility, living in each one of those facilities. He had a home in every facility, and basically a transnational man. Let's put it that way. He was a new type of business figure that worked all over the Americas. At this time, or under Bosch, Bacardi would also expand to the Bahamas, to Martinique, to Brazil, to Bermuda. So the company is truly becoming a Pan-American entity as much as a Cuban company. So it becomes a real global enterprise. These are two images that are not exactly concurrent, but I like to show them together. On the left is a house that Pepín Bosch commissioned for himself in Varadero, which is outside, it's a beach outside of Havana. And the architect is Philip Johnson. It's a very important moment for Bosch because in the first decade of his work with Bacardi, he largely hires local, regional architects to do most of the projects that he's doing. All of a sudden, in the 1950s, late 1950s, he becomes inspired by this idea of using, I guess what might be called star architects, or starchitects, to build, to build striking projects that will probably become icons in the international architectural press. And this project by Johnson is quite interesting as a home. It's like a bird cage. Depending on the version, it's 14-sided or 16-sided. The ground floor was enclosed and comprised bedrooms and kitchens and back of house spaces. And you would go up through a central stair to the upper level of the house. And at that upper level, you were under this incredible multi-story high open air room, panoramically open to the beach on all sides. And the buildings, you can see, was sit directly on the beach. It was built with concrete conical vaults. Johnson was in Cuba at that moment working on a hotel for the American, I guess we'll call him a gangster, Meyer Lansky, which was on the Malecon. He met Johnson and immediately commissioned him to do the house. On the right is a hospitality pavilion that was built at the Hatue Brewery in El Cotoro, which is outside of Havana. And it's also in the round. And it uses royal palms to create a kind of bohío, which is a Cuban native hut, but a very unusual one, let's say. So it may have been through the connection with Johnson that Bosch met Mies van der Rohe. But Bosch himself professed to have hired Mies van der Rohe because he was inspired by Mies's idea of creating a universal space, of creating a single open space office or environment that could be, that was an image, that would be a new image for the transparency of this modern corporation of Bacardi. And for Bacardi, he designed one of his most memorable and important building types, which is a kind of a floating deck square supported on 8 pyramidal columns, and inset underneath this roof was a sort of a glass box. The idea was that was to make the workings of the company transparent and open. Bosch believed in the modern corporation as an entity, as a sort of a social organization, and as a business tool. What made this all possible is that the building is on a plinth, and that all of the rest of the building is hidden underneath. And this building would become an important landmark, not just for Mies, but for Bacardi, and I think the way it goes back and forth is quite interesting. Just to show an image also from the Mies office, a collage, one of Mies's famous material collage, perspective collages, that begins to introduce materials and textures into what is otherwise a perspectival ink drawing, but here showing a sort of a view of what the city would have looked like through the glass walls of the corporate office. The building was never built because Bacardi had issues with the Cuban president at the time, Batista, and then eventually with Castro. But the building was quite largely published, broadly published. It was probably the most broadly published building for a building that was never built. Most magazines featured it. Mies himself designed the cover image for Architectural Design. On the left, for the cover of Architectural Forum, you can see the structural system, the drawing that Mies did to explain this kind of waffle slab of concrete with the 8 columns, just the system itself, with no other intervening information. And although the building was never built by Mies in Cuba, it was proposed 2 other times, one for a private gallery in Schweinfurt in Germany, and the second time for the new museum in Berlin, where it was actually built in steel, not in concrete, but it was built more or less the same building with a larger plinth. Now, just to move to another realm, Bacardi had these 2 very important facilities that had developed in Puerto Rico and in Mexico. I think the strategy of the company was, first of all, that these facilities would hedge against, let's say, political or economic instability again in Cuba. But they were also a way to, let's say, become part of the markets in which they were located. So by establishing in Puerto Rico, they were an American corporation. By establishing in Mexico, they were a Mexican corporation, and so on. In order to establish in Puerto Rico, which was a very difficult gambit in the sense that Puerto Rico had its own rum industry, and they were not very friendly to this Cuban powerhouse rum distiller coming in and establishing themselves there. They created a very civic image to the community there. Their first headquarters was actually in a former hospital building in Old San Juan, in the area just outside of Old San Juan. It was the last Spanish colonial building built. It's a monumental structure that sits at the entrance to the city, and it really was a way of sort of declaring their presence on the island. But the next phase, just a few years later in the late 1940s, was that they built a campus, an industrial campus just outside of San Juan, in a neighborhood called Palo Seco, which was directly across the bay from Old San Juan, so very visible. And the distillery was located in this multi-story structure in which the actual distillery infrastructure was sort of housed within an architectural envelope. And this is very much, to my eyes, like the language of the American PWA or WPA programs of the 1930s, the programs initiated by President Roosevelt to get the economy motivated in the United States. And this is the first period of industrialization in Puerto Rico, and the architecture uses that same civic language to, to sort of create its presence. But quickly, the architecture on this campus changes. It becomes much more eclectic. On the left, you see a project by Felix Candela, never built on this campus, but hyperbolic paraboloid vaults, very thin shell concrete, open air warehouse meant for aging barrels of rum. And on the right, a kind of a version of that by a very important collaborator of Bacardi in both in Cuba and abroad, and that's a company called SACMAG, Science Cancio Martin Alvarez Gutierrez, which was a very large company in Havana. It was kind of almost like a New York or Chicago model of an architectural firm, very large, very integrated with engineering and landscape architecture and urban planning and programming, all built in, and working with industries. And Science, the engineer, the S in SACMAG, designed this merendero, this pavilion, as a kind of hospitality pavilion for the company. Another structure just across from all this is by a Cuban architect named Miguel Rosich, and it repeats the canonical vaults that we saw a moment ago in the proposal for Philip Johnson, by Philip Johnson for Bosch, and it's a family museum. And so here you see some of the important building types that Bacardi is reiterating in its projects. Museums to kind of memorialize their own culture. A merendero, a kind of a bar or hospitality space for entertainment, as a place to kind of taste test Bacardi drinks, as well as distilleries. And on this campus are also these large murals by a Catalan muralist named Rosalia Pujo, which are abstract images of Puerto Rican flora and fauna and insects. And then to Mexico, where Bosch himself was the director for several years of the Mexican operation, so very invested in what happened here. And unlike what happened in Puerto Rico, where the campus became very eclectic and changed over time, in Mexico, the two campuses were built very quickly and very, well, there are many interesting points to discuss about the differences in the buildings, but let's say that's a coherent plan, I think. The first facility that they built is southwest of Puebla, in a place called La Galarza, which is a sugar-producing area in the Matamoros Valley. And here, Felix Candela designs a series of industrial structures that are built along a road, in front of the complex, that explore different uses of vaulting technology, concrete vaults, thin shell structures, handkerchief vault, like the one on the far left, or barrel vaults. But the other part of this structure is a tower that was designed by Louis Sanz of SACMAG, which is the distilling tower, which is a new model of tower, a kind of, I think of it as a rocket ship, rocket port looking structure, but it's a new image of a distilling tower, very different than the one we saw in Puerto Rico. And then the third part of this was the collaboration with Hector Mestre and Manuel de la Colina, who, as far as I understand, designed the rehabilitation and reuse of the old hacienda around which the distillery is built. And so there are a number of interesting themes here, I think. In the era before preservation, at least before the modern preservation movement as we know it here, is an attempt to reuse these structures, although in a very different way. I mean, the structures are stripped down to the basic brick and stone, and you can see how new vaulted industrial areas are sort of loaded just behind them. And then the second facility was in Tultitlan, just outside of Mexico City, or in the north part of Mexico City. And here Felix Candela with Landa designed a series of vaulted structures. This is an aerial photograph which I think shows the nature of the Candela works, Candela and Landa works, which are really a landscape unto themselves, of different vault types, hyperbolic paraboloid vaults forming the main bottling plant, which is in the center, inverted hyperbolic paraboloid umbrellas, which I understand are built all over this region, but are here used to house warehouses and aging warehouses around that main bottling plant, and then canonical vaults, or conical vaults, or barrel vaults, sorry, in the finishing area. This is the bottling plant itself, and built in a very thin shell, with a very thin shell of concrete, spanning great distances. Originally projected as 9 bays, but only 3 built in the first phase. Candela himself mentions the influence of Minoru Yamasaki's St. Louis Airport, but I think it's a far superior building, much thinner vaults, much more elegantly sort of articulated, and creating a very beautiful open space on the interior that is probably more like a train station or the baths of Carcala or something than a bottling plant. But an extraordinary use of vaults by an architect who believed that the thin shell concrete vault would transform space in architecture. The umbrella vaults, or the umbrella structures that he used elsewhere in the complex, and you can see a diagram to the right of these, which were a feature of Cubiertas Ala, the company that Candela founded. And then in front of the building, the administration complex, originally designed by SACMAG also, but after the failure of the Santiago building to be constructed, Bosch went back to Mies van der Rohe and asked him to design this structure as well. It's a variant of the type of space that he proposed for Santiago. It's one large open space on the second floor with partitions that begin to divide it and to create offices at the ends. But the most important part is probably the way it's lifted off the ground and the way it cantilevers to create a sort of an idea of lightness and openness, and the double height entrance, which is how you arrive at the second floor of the building. Right now, his building, I mean, the Mies buildings and we can talk about this more, the Mies buildings and the Candela buildings are quite in contrast to each other. And the Candela buildings form their own context in the sense that there are many of them, and there are spaces between them, so you can almost get a sense of the landscape that they create. The Mies building is very singular, but in fact there were other Mies structures that would have been created that were never finished. An entrance gate, a cafeteria and a bar that would have populated the green space in front and around the building, so it would have also created a context for the main administration building had it been completed. This period, as this period is ending, let's say late 1950s, early 1960s, Bacardi is truly at its centenary, in fact 1962, a company with many faces and with many homes. This is published in their centenary book. They had a global vision. They published a journal which was designed to kind of assemble all of these nations and all these Bacardi facilities and people in around the Caribbean, around the Americas, under one flag, under one Bacardi identity. But at that moment, the Cuban Revolution, the departure of Bacardi from Cuba, Bacardi becomes even more a transnational business in the sense that its original home is no longer its home. And Bosch even more traveling between these new locations and running this far-flung transnational enterprise. But at that moment, at the moment of perhaps greatest weakness, Bosch also decided to build a new headquarters for its American operations, which were previously located in New York City. And he hired the firm SACMAG, which was now exiled in Puerto Rico, to design the building in Miami, just north of downtown along Biscayne Boulevard, which is sort of an extension, an arterial extension of the downtown northward, in an area with a lot of other corporate headquarters. IBM was there, National Cash Register, NCR was there, and a number of other major American corporations. So it was a place that Bacardi wanted to be. It's a very daring and audacious building. Structurally, it is supported by only 4 piers, which you can see in the foreground, and there's 2 in the background, that rise all the way to the roof of the building. They carry a large steel truss embedded, encased in concrete, and the floors are hung by that truss. It's a very small building, so one wonders about the necessity for such efforts to create transparency, lightness. But it was very important for Bacardi to use this building to sort of reassert its corporate image in the new landscape of post-revolutionary Cuba and the Americas. And one other very sort of interesting aspect of the building are its 2 faces, because I think it is kind of a 2-faced building. On the one face, facing east towards the water, is a kind of very formal skin, a glass curtain wall, that would have been found in any corporate building, at least in North America at the time, probably here as well. And on the south and north facades, where the shear walls were located, the walls that were stabilizing the structure, these murals by the Brazilian artist Francisco Brenand. Now, this is a building that I think in some way embodies the idea of mix, of synthesis, or symbiosis that one can find in these Bacardi projects, because Bosch himself notes in a letter that he wants the building to be covered in murals like the UNAM, like the Central Library at UNAM, which he's seen. He hires a Brazilian artist, a Cuban architect located in Puerto Rico, and builds the building in Miami. So it's a very synthetic work, let's say. And then just behind that work, another interesting structure rises 10 years later by the architect Ignacio Carrera Justiz. And this work is an expansion, it's kind of an expansion of their business offices. But similarly, the building is carried on a central column or trunk that rises to the top. There are trusses at the top that spread out, and then the building is hung from those trusses. And what that allows is for the walls of the building to be entirely glass, but they're not glass, they're muralized. And they're not muralized with paintings or with tiles this time, but they're muralized with stained glass pieces built in France, based on a work commissioned by Bacardi by the German artist Johannes Dietz, which is a kind of evocation of the bat and the production of sugar, here muralized into the four walls of the building and carried over this plaza. And I forgot to mention that one of the extraordinary features of this building is it has a plaza. And while that might not be extraordinary to you, I can't think of another plaza in Miami. In fact, it's not a North American device, but here used as a very powerful space, and still used today. The building is no longer occupied by Bacardi. It's moved to a new headquarters in Coral Gables, another town nearby. But it's used by an arts organization. Frank Gehry is doing the architect Frank Gehry is doing the master plan for the performing arts component that will be added to the structure. Also in the 1970s, the idea, so that headquarters in Miami was really the North American headquarters, but the idea of a new headquarters for the corporation, and in this case, in Bermuda. And if the building looks familiar, it's because it's an evocation of Mises' project by Cuban architects Eguilior and Eduardo, husband-wife team. And they basically took Mises' idea, but they also transformed it. It's not a literal reproduction of the building. It stands in a kind of a suburban area of Hamilton in Bermuda. It uses glass in a very different way. There are no metal frames to the glass. There are kind of curtains that run on the inside of the glass, but the most important thing is that there's no emphasis on transparency here. As you look through the building, instead of seeing through the building, what you see is a large mural of Cuba, which was mounted straight on the face of the building. So a very different type of building, but a very similar evocation. So what was this about? Was it a nostalgia for the project that was never built in Havana, or was it a kind of a reiteration of a type that Bacardi understood in a sense as its own? This is a look at the interior. I don't think Mies would have approved, but this was done by an Austrian interior designer named Maria Bergson, who mixed many media and styles in her work. The ceiling is this night sky in Santiago on the night that the company was founded. The furniture is by Knoll. The carpets are by a carpet weaver named Vysotsky, and each one is individualized per room to identify the various regions and companies in which Bacardi was working. And then it's interesting, in case there's any doubt that Bacardi saw this as its type, here is another building designed for Bacardi in San Juan, at its facility there, which was an administration headquarters, which is a very similar building. This is designed by Skidmore, Owings and Merrill. And the building here is the same raised concrete plate, the wrapping inset glass walls, the columnar periphery. But in this case, the earth has been, it's a kind of an earthwork as well. The earth has been bermed up to the structure, allowing you to enter into the plinth that in the original Mies structure would have been the place where we put everything we don't want to see in the structure. So for the final phase, which I call global regional, as a backdrop, in 1992, the various pieces, the various companies of Bacardi merged into a single corporation, and then there's a purchase of other brands, of other spirits, and so Bacardi all of a sudden becomes no longer just a rum distiller, but a distiller of spirits of many types, many genres, gin, vodka, you name it. And in order to highlight these products, these various products, they use their experience in building homes for their company in far-flung places, in different places around the globe, to build what are called brand homes for these new brands, or not new brands, but brands that they've acquired. And I wanted to show you two of them because I think they're interesting. This one is it's called Le Logis, it's in Cognac, and it's for Grey Goose, the vodka, which is a Bacardi vodka. Now, when you go to this facility, you don't really see any references to Bacardi at all, because what this facility is about is creating the identity of Grey Goose as a regional product. Grey Goose is a French vodka. It's made with wheat, the same wheat that you use to make baguettes in Paris, as you will learn if you go to this facility. It's located in a chateau, in an absolutely beautiful area right outside of a small village. The interiors are by a Milan-based firm called Dimore. Half of this project is basically a boutique hotel where you are wined and dined and where you basically socialize with others. And the other half is a learning facility where you have hands-on sort of introduction to the materials that are used in the product, where you can sit around a table and learn from the master distiller what goes in, what are the engineering constraints, how do they assure quality, etc. So, but it's a way of building a kind of a brand loyalty or brand understanding, bringing people to this facility and having them sort of experience the product in so many different ways. Another aspect of that is the Bombay Sapphire Gin Distillery right outside of London, southwest of London in Hampshire, which is it's in a place called Laverstoke, in a mill that was once used to, in fact for 300 years it was used to produce the British pound note. It was the place where they printed British pound notes. And that mill had been abandoned, and so the company, Bacardi, rehabilitated both the mill buildings and the landscape around. It's a really unusual facility. You walk through this kind of these old brick buildings. They're like lofts on the interior. They're all open. You have, you can experience the materials that go into the gin, but it's a very aestheticized experience, a very brand-built sort of experience. On the back, and the work was done by Thomas Heatherwick, the British architect Thomas Heatherwick, are two greenhouses that are used to grow the botanicals that are used in the gin, so that people can come in, you know, feel the plants, sniff them, see what they look like. It's quite interesting experience if you go. So what can we take away from this story? This large history of Bacardi and sprawling history of Bacardi. Well, you know, partially it's a compelling story because it challenges some of what we know about corporate architecture, established ideas about corporate architecture. There never was really observed and worked with preservation and conservation long before that was typical. And there's a type of collective memory in the company that links all of these things, that ties them all together. In fact, the way Bacardi has used the medium of design to define itself as a window into, you know, beyond corporate architecture, into architecture's capacities and its limits. It shows how architecture can unfold in multidimensional ways and acquire multiple meanings. It supports the idea that architecture has the power to represent and to influence and to negotiate and to communicate. In short, the architecture is an expressive act. In this inventory of work, notions of synthesis, pluralism, flexibility, respect for heritage, and the importance of myth and play commingle with functional necessity. So I think it's a way of thinking about architecture beyond functionalism and beyond you know, what we always assume are the normal boundaries of the architect. And in this work, the work of iconic designers like Mies van der Rohe and Felix Candela, you know, mesh and meld with other architects, with local and regional architects who produce novel and conceptually grounded designs. This adaptability makes the company a compelling case study, not just of global corporate architecture, but I think of architecture in general, where pluralisms often seem so absent. Thank you very much.
Bueno, ahora vamos a pasar a... Bueno, quiero darle la bienvenida al doctor Juan Ignacio del Cueto, que llegó un poquito tarde, pero que es el organizador de todo esto. Vamos a pasar a una sesión, bueno, hay dos opciones, pasar a una sesión de preguntas y respuestas ahorita. Las preguntas, ustedes pueden plantearlas en español o en inglés, como quieran. Si las plantean en español, Dino y yo intentaremos traducirlas. Intentaré traducirlas. La otra opción es que Dino y yo trajimos unas cuantas imágenes para hacer una especie de conversación de presentaciones entre Allan y nosotros dos también, desde la perspectiva local. Entonces, o nos escuchan a Dino y a mí primero y luego hacemos las preguntas, o las preguntas ahora y después las presentacioncitas mías y de Dino, como quieran. Pero voy a hablar un poco de otro contexto internacional, que es el contexto de la Guerra Fría, ¿no? Me imagino que reconocen a estos personajes, ¿no? Bueno, les puedo ir contando que el libro de Allan viene a ser un gran apoyo para muchos de los que hacemos investigación en esto, porque no existía una perspectiva completa de este contexto internacional de la arquitectura y de la cultura panamericana, como le llama él, ¿no? Yo usé, si se fijaron, usé mucho al principio en la introducción la palabra latinoamericano, pero en realidad los estadounidenses estaban presentes todo el tiempo, ¿no? Estaban en la mente de los cubanos todo el tiempo los Estados Unidos, de la misma forma en que para México los Estados Unidos estaban permanentemente en su mente, y para todo el mundo, para todo el planeta, ¿no? ¿Alguien sabe quiénes son? ¿Nadie sabe ya quiénes son? No, no es Candela. Pero se parecen, qué chistoso. Sí. Es Fidel Castro. ¿Y el otro quién es? El Che Guevara. Cuando le enseñé esta foto a mi mamá, inmediatamente reconoció al Che y dijo, wow, lo conseguiste sin camisa, ¿no? Era como un sex symbol para las mujeres de esa generación. Bueno, ¿y dónde están? En Lecumberri, en la cárcel de Lecumberri. ¿Y por qué estaban en la cárcel de Lecumberri? Porque estaban organizando la revolución cubana, ¿no? Y unos de los grandes que apoyaron esto fue José María Bosch, el director de Bacardi que ya habíamos visto. Bueno, hay imágenes que se repiten, de las que yo hablo Allan, y trataré de ser muy, muy rápido, ¿no? Bueno, este es el Museo de los Bacardi. Ya nos habló Allan de esto. Había un interés por la arquitectura siempre en la familia Bacardi, que venían de Cataluña, ¿no? Según Bosch, como ya nos dijo Allan, Bosch se inspiró en este tipo de edificios de Mies para hacer los edificios para Santiago de Cuba y para la Ciudad de México. Aquí está otra imagen del de Santiago. Más imágenes. Y este es el edificio olvidado y desconocido en México, que es el de Bacardi, ¿no? Y es bastante interesante que a nosotros no nos haya importado casi nunca el edificio de Bacardi, porque el segundo edificio con más fotografías de la edición de principios de los 60 de Space, Time and Architecture de Gideon es Bacardi, México, después del monasterio de la Tourette de Le Corbusier. Pero nosotros no reparamos eso, y pasan generaciones de estudiantes y estudiantes leyendo este libro y nadie repara en que es el libro más fotográfico, con más imágenes, digamos, el edificio, perdón. Entonces, yo tuve la oportunidad de hablar con Gene Sommers, que era el jefe de este proyecto cuando Mies estaba diseñando muchas otras cosas. Gene Sommers es un arquitecto de Texas, es muy grande ya, que tuvo un papel muy importante en el diseño del SIGRAM, por ejemplo. Entonces, Mies le encarga diseñar el de México. Entonces, por correo hemos hablado y me ha contado la historia de cómo proyectaron Bacardi México. Y buscando en los archivos nos encontramos con esta imagen de este edificio de 1952, es decir, 6 años anterior al de México. Y como ven es bastante parecido al mexicano, sino es que prácticamente igual. Y le pregunté a Sommers que si no tenía cierta influencia este proyecto con el suyo para México. Muy escuetamente me dijo que podía ser y que ese edificio era para tal cosa. Pero es muy probable que venga de aquí, ¿no? Y es muy chistoso que en México se hable tan poquito de Mies cuando nos gustaba mucho hablar de extranjeros. Este es Hannes Meyer, es un monográfico sobre Hannes Meyer en la revista Arquitectura y Decoración. Y es muy chistoso también que la mayoría de la gente repite que Mies nunca vino a México, que Mies mandó los planos del edificio cubano y lo reprodujimos en México, cuando no tienen nada que ver el edificio de México y el edificio de Santiago. Tenían objetivos completamente distintos. Entonces ahí está Mies, como siempre pisteando, como decimos aquí, en la borrachera, con la generación joven, ¿no? De Ramón Torres, González Rull, Héctor Velázquez. Esta es la planta del edificio como realmente se construyó. Es la única que hay que es fiel a lo construido. Todas las demás reproducen el anteproyecto. Gideon, por ejemplo, reproduce el primer proyecto, la primera versión del proyecto. Y esta es la planta alta. Si uno va al archivo de Bacardi, se da cuenta de que todo el diseño gira alrededor de los núcleos. Hay a la izquierda hay un núcleo de baños, sala de juntas, bodegas y tal, y a la derecha hay otro igual. Entonces, cuando uno va leyendo el archivo, se va dando cuenta que todo el diseño gira alrededor de esos muros. Se hacen más anchos, se hacen más largos, el plafón sube, el plafón baja, el piso sube, etcétera, etcétera. Pero todo el espacio está definido de entrada desde el día 1 y es inamovible. En la planta alta, que es esta, y me voy para atrás, y en la planta baja también, ¿no? Un edificio de planta libre que era más como ahorita que Allan estaba hablando de cómo el edificio de Santiago era más bien un bar, perdón, de La Habana, era más bien un bar, no tanto unas oficinas para Bacardi. La planta baja de este edificio me recuerda también a un gran espacio social, ¿no? Que un vestíbulo de entrada a unas oficinas, ¿no? Sí, era un gran espacio social para poderse tomar un buen ron o una buena cerveza. Entonces, a la derecha tienen el edificio cubano, que era de concreto, que era infinitamente más monumental que el mexicano. A la izquierda está el mexicano, que es bastante sencillo. Esto es lo que estaba haciendo Mies antes de empezar a trabajar con la compañía cubana, que es el SIGRAM. Y esto es en lo que más énfasis hace Gideon. Lo dice de forma más o menos literal. Dice, Mies en Bacardi, México, llega al equilibrio perfecto entre planos horizontales y verticalidad. Es la única vez que Gideon habla de perfección en la arquitectura de Mies, porque la relación Gideon-Mies al principio no era la mejor, ¿no? De hecho, no sale en las primeras ediciones de sus libros, es hasta después. Y esto es el edificio mexicano. Estas son fotos tomadas desde el mismo ángulo en que las tomó Gideon en su tiempo, las tomó Cristina. Y este es el interior. Hay unas historias buenísimas al respecto del travertino. Cuando están proyectando los edificios, el cubano y el mexicano están pensando en materiales y dan por sentado, por ejemplo, que en México no va a haber travertino y plantean un terrazo. Y entonces, Cubierta Sala, el hermano de Candela, le da unas muestras a Somers del travertino mexicano y se queda estupefacto por lo bonito y bueno que es y por lo barato. Se lleva la muestra a Chicago para enseñársela a Mies y Mies dice, por supuesto, le vamos a poner travertino mexicano a los dos edificios, al mexicano y al cubano. Y así hacen todo el edificio con travertino. Hay cosas pasan en el proceso, por ejemplo, el cantero que les dijo que tenía toda la superficie para cubrir todo el edificio, se acaba la veta del mármol, entonces tienen que ir a sacar mármol de aproximadamente 1 kilómetro de ahí, ¿no? Y entonces Somers revisa las muestras y hay una variación de color microscópica. Pero eso para mí era inconcebible. Entonces, cuenta la leyenda, en el archivo no dice, pero en Bacardi hay algunas leyendas, probablemente tú nos podrás decir, de que Mies mandó levantar la mitad del travertino que ya tenía el edificio y pedir todo el edificio, todo el travertino nuevamente. No sé si sea cierto, eso en los archivos no se corrobora, es una leyenda que no sé si sea real. Ya luego tú nos dirás. Ok, va. Ok. Exacto. Bueno, este es el descanso y es una sola pieza de travertino. Los típicos perfiles de vigasís. Bueno, y después no puede construir el edificio cubano en Cuba y acaba haciendo una propuesta para Schweinfurt, como ya nos dijo Allan, y no se logra, y luego acaba muy cerca del muro de Berlín, en la Guerra Fría. Es el cuadradito que está abajo a la izquierda, que dice Neue Nationalgalerie, que es la Galería Nacional de Berlín, de Alemania, más bien, donde los alemanes occidentales ponen todos sus edificios más representativos para que los vean perfectamente los alemanes del lado comunista. Uno de los que ponen es el edificio de Santiago de Cuba, que acaba construido en acero en Berlín, ¿no? Esto es más o menos como se ve desde la parte comunista. Les paso unas fotos rápidamente. La columna, que es extraordinaria, y la influencia en el resto de Alemania de esta arquitectura de Mies en la Guerra Fría, ¿no? Y cómo en ese contexto de la Guerra Fría acaba acá, con mucho menor calidad, en las Islas Bermudas. Ya nos habló Allan más de la interpretación del edificio de Santiago de Cuba en las Bermudas, no muy afortunada, la verdad. Y listo, es todo lo que yo quería decirles.
Yo voy a hablar muy rápidamente de la intervención de Candela en el proyecto de la planta embotelladora. Ya Allan nos mostró la planta destiladora que está en la Galarza, Puebla. ¿Se pueden apagar estas luces? Y vamos a ver rápidamente también el caso de Candela en la Bacardi. La ubica entre sus 25 obras favoritas en Ciudad de México, y allá arriba la ven ubicada, ¿no?, en la salida a Querétaro. Es prácticamente un muestrario de diferentes tipos de cascarones que hacía Cubierta Sala, la empresa de Candela, y ahí aparece el pequeño edificio de Mies van der Rohe, que es la única obra de Mies en Latinoamérica, la única que acaba construyendo. Tiene otros proyectos, pero la única que construye. Y estos son planos que tenemos aquí abajo en el Archivo de Arquitectos Mexicanos. El ingeniero Luis Torres Landa fue el engarce, digamos, el contacto entre SACMAG, ya también Allan nos habló de esta compañía, bueno, esta firma cubana que trabajaba para la Bacardi, SACMAG, Sáenz, Cancio, Martín, Álvarez y Gutiérrez. El único arquitecto era Gutiérrez, Enrique Gutiérrez, los demás eran ingenieros. No se ve muy bien, pero bueno, se puede ir viendo cómo evoluciona el proyecto. Vean que este está fechado el 7 de julio de 1958 y bueno, aparece ahí Luis Torres Landa, ingeniero civil, y aquí Sáenz, Cancio, Martín, Álvarez y Gutiérrez, ingenieros, arquitectos, constructores, Habana, Cuba. Y el siguiente, este es de septiembre del 58 y aparece ya el sello de cubierta sala de la empresa de Candela y una serie de ajustes que se van haciendo. Esta imagen la vimos también con Allan, ¿no? Esta es la autopista ya prácticamente a Querétaro, un poquito antes de llegar a la caseta de cobro, llegar a Tepozotlán. Y ahí están pues las diferentes cubiertas, muchos paraguas en estacionamientos. Ahí al fondo se ven las bóvedas cilíndricas cortas, paraguas también en los comedores, en los talleres y bodegas. El paraguas, pues la pieza que más construyó Candela por económica. Y lo interesante aquí es ver cómo utilizó diferentes tipos de paraguas y cómo seguía experimentando Candela. Estamos hablando de 1958, ya Candela había construido muchísimos paraguas, ya los dominaba y los hacía casi como churros, ¿no? Y ahí se ve uno de los cortes de la planta embotelladora. Hay algunas imágenes, muchas vienen del archivo de Bacardi, otras tomadas por mí. Bueno, los talleres y esto que es muy poco conocido, al fondo de la planta embotelladora hay unas cuantas casitas de viviendas hechas con paraguas invertidos, ¿no? Los 4 segmentos de paraboloide hiperbólico y con su pequeño, digamos, umbral con un paragüitas también, bastante interesantes. Y luego la zona de embotellado, las 400,000 barricas de ron. Esta foto está tomada en 1962. Se dieron cuenta que se evaporaba mucho ron en estas barricas, se evaporaba mucho alcohol y entonces pidieron cubrir, hacer una especie de, pues eso, de sombrilla. Y curiosamente el primer encargo no se lo hicieron a Candela, y esto lo pudimos comprobar aquí abajo, sino a Sada Rangel, una constructora, Sada Rangel, que levantó estos paraguas de 14 por 14 metros, o sea, voladizos de 7 metros. Y luego a Candela le encargaron otra parte y Candela experimentó y dijo, bueno, en lugar de hacer paraguas cuadrados de 14 por 14, voy a hacer unos paraguas pues prácticamente de 6 por 18 metros, algo así, ¿no? Estos son los de, digamos, el conjunto que existía cuando recibe cubierta sala. Vean que hay 4 zonas de paraguas construidas por Sada y 2 zonas de paraguas construidas por cubierta sala. ¿Qué hace? Son estas que se ven aquí y que después Candela en realidad lo que hace es un experimento muy interesante. En lugar de 14 metros de apoyo a apoyo, consigue con una estrategia que ahorita vamos a explicar que haya casi 28 metros de apoyo a apoyo, o sea, prácticamente el doble, haciendo esta estrategia, o sea, volando, haciendo continuar 2 de los paraboloides hiperbólicos, 5 metros, o sea, cada paraboloide hiperbólico vuela 7,5 y prolonga 5 metros que luego lo apoya contra el otro, se hace una lógica estructural contundente de equivalencia, digamos, de esfuerzos, ¿no? Se contrarrestan unos con otros y entonces hace estos paraguas muy hermosos con casi, como decía, casi 28 metros entre apoyo y apoyo. Vean que la distribución, claro, es una distribución más eficiente de las barricas, que ya no están en posición horizontal, sino en posición vertical. Esto es un poco la comparación entre unos y otros, ¿no? Los paraguas que había construido Sada, que al final tuvieron que ponerles unos apoyos porque se estaban colgando, y los que hizo Candela, separándolos. Además, aquí están juntos unos con otros. Esto era un problema, solucionar la junta de los paraguas. En cambio, separándolos se conseguía, pues eso, incluso meter luz entre unos y otros, y se evitaba el problema constructivo. Esto es un poco lo que sucedió después. Las fotos de la izquierda las tomé en 1999, las de la derecha unos años después. Decidieron cerrar en la planta, pues, por cuestiones pues de la producción, y bueno, llegaron los muros hasta el tope. Ya no se ven ni siquiera digamos, el borde de los paraguas. Pusieron aquí unos fotomurales para dar idea de lo que hay atrás, pero ya no se ven las barricas. Lo único que se ve ahora, si se dan cuenta, que aquí se alcanzan a ver pues esta especie de crestas que generaba la continuación de los paraboloides. Aquí vuelven a aparecer. Y este es el interior, ¿no? Es muy interesante por la misma solución esta de separar los paraguas. Penetra luz natural y tiene una relación muy interesante, pero en realidad la joya de la corona de este conjunto, aparte del edificio de Mies, es la planta de embotellado, que, como vimos antes, tuvo dos etapas constructivas. Estos son los proyectos previos a que Candela recibiera el encargo. Vuelven a estar firmados por el arquitecto Luis Torres Landa, y son algunas búsquedas, ¿no?, de cómo solucionar la cubierta, en este caso con unos cascarones alargados. Al final lo que usó, digamos, es otra, es el anteproyecto que no se construyó. Vean que las fechas son muy importantes. Aquí estos son de junio de 1958, firmado por Torres Landa. Y bueno, esta es otra opción del mismo, ¿no?, de Torres Landa, julio del 58. Y para junio del 59 aparece esta propuesta de cubierta sala. Félix Candela propone usar 3 bóvedas por arista del mayor claro que había construido, 30 metros de apoyo a apoyo, y librar así con esas 3 cubiertas, que además tienen una solución muy interesante, porque el paraboloide se corta con un plano inclinado, cada uno de los paraboloides, y entonces se aproximan y se genera esta especie de costura tragaluz que hace que el interior sea muy luminoso. Son 30 por 90 metros, o sea, 2.700 metros cuadrados, sin apoyos intermedios. Aquí se ve un poco la evolución del proyecto en sí. No nos vamos a detener en esto. Vean cómo estos llegaban desde Cuba prácticamente, estos proyectos. Y aquí aparece ya la propuesta de Candela, por eso es interesante. Y aparecen hasta 3, o sea, hasta 3 crujías, cada una de las crujías formada por 3 cascarones, 9 cascarones en total. Se construyó la primera parte, ya comentó Allan, que estaba inspirado en este edificio de Minoru Yamasaki. El arquitecto Minoru Yamasaki, no sé si lo ubican, ahora hablaremos de él muy brevemente, pero interviene aquí Anton Tedesco. Este es muy importante porque este ingeniero alemán emigra a los Estados Unidos y desarrolla o construye muchos cascarones en Estados Unidos. La diferencia, vean la diferencia de la curva, esto en realidad son bóvedas cilíndricas, mientras que aquí Candela está manejando paraboloides hiperbólicos. son también, digamos, en el caso de abajo son bóvedas por arista, en el caso de arriba bóvedas nervadas. Como les decía, Minoru Yamasaki quizá es más famoso por lo que le han tirado que por lo que construyó. Evidentemente le tiraron lo que construyó. Pruitt-Igoe en San Luis, Missouri, y las Torres Gemelas en Nueva York, que tristemente las echaron abajo. Obviamente en Pruitt-Igoe sacaron a la gente primero, y en 1972 tiraron este conjunto de viviendas, y esta fotografía la utilizó Charles Jenks en su famoso libro El lenguaje de la arquitectura postmoderna, con la frase fin de la arquitectura moderna, con una fecha y casi una hora, ¿no? El 15 de julio de 1972 acaba la utopía de la arquitectura moderna. Unos años después, casi 30 años después, pues viene Osama Bin Laden y baja las Torres Gemelas, muy dramático. Pero bueno, lo que nos interesa es la comparación. Candela dice que se inspiró en esta propuesta, pero que dijo que estas eran bóvedas nervadas y que él podía solucionarlo con bóvedas por arista, que ya, digamos, es esa aportación mexicana a la historia de la construcción que hacen de la Mora a López Carmona y Candela en la Bolsa Mexicana de Valores. Incluso en 1956, Candela, para el concurso del Mercado de la Merced, propone esta especie de planta de cruz latina cubierta con un sistema de bóvedas por arista. Al final no gana ese concurso, no puede construir esto, pero a la siguiente oportunidad que tiene, que es en la Bacardi, las levanta. Esta es la Bolsa Mexicana de Valores. Enrique de la Mora le pide a su joven colaborador Fernando López Carmona que le solucione una cubierta inspirada en el crucero de la bóveda de la Purísima en Monterrey. Aquí está la bóveda de la Purísima. Ahí los ingenieros les obligaron a poner nervaduras. López Carmona entendió que era una intersección, pues la bóveda por arista que habían inventado 2000 años antes los romanos, pues la intersección de dos bóvedas de cañón corrido te genera la bóveda por arista, y lo que se le ocurrió a López Carmona fue intersectar dos bóvedas de paraboloide hiperbólico del tipo silla de montar, que él ya había visto aquí en el pabellón de rayos cósmicos, la primera que construyó Candela con paraboloides hiperbólicos. La idea de esta intersección es de López Carmona, se la presentan a Candela. Candela dice que es una idea genial y que desde luego que la pueden construir, y la acaban construyendo. Aquí no sale esto, pero bueno, después van a hacer muchas bóvedas por arista. Ahí está la primera, la Bolsa Mexicana de Valores. San Antonio de las Huertas, la iglesia, es la segunda. En Acapulco hacen el hermoso cabaret La Jacaranda, que era casi una palapa pétrea. Los manantiales es a final de cuentas una bóveda por arista de 8 gajos, o sea 4 cañones de paraboloide hiperbólico intersectados. En el Casino de la Selva y en la caseta de ventas Verde Valle en Guadalajara también construyen con bóvedas por arista. En el caso del Casino de la Selva es una planta pentagonal, son 5 gajos. Hace otras propuestas que no llegan a construirse, el mismo Candela, y finalmente la puede construir en la Bacardi. Hace esta propuesta que tiene su antecedente en esta idea de lo que él había proyectado para la estación del tren infantil en el bosque de Chapultepec, ¿no? que se abrían tragaluces en el en la unión de las bóvedas por arista, y ahí está, ¿no? La primera etapa. Ya vimos algunas imágenes, una sola crujía con 3 naves, un espacio impresionante. Y 10 años después, cuando Candela ya estaba en Estados Unidos, le encargan a Cubierta Sala, que se había quedado a cargo de Antonio Candela, la ampliación, y Juan Antonio Tonda, a quien perdimos hace unos meses, esto también lo tenemos aquí en el Archivo de Arquitectos Mexicanos, hace el cálculo para hacer la ampliación. Simplemente espejean, se hace la segunda crujía, la tercera ya nunca se construyó, o sea, y se hace un espacio cubierto de 60 por 90, 5.400 metros cuadrados, solo con 2 zonas de apoyo al interior. Este es el proceso constructivo. Ya las cimbras se hace digamos, la estructura de la cimbra ya no es de madera, es tubular, se construye el molde o la cimbra por encima y ahí se cuela, y aquí está ya las dos crujías que generan un espacio interior impactante auténticamente. Es uno de los grandes espacios de la arquitectura del siglo XX, que curiosamente es un espacio no para una iglesia, no es un espacio religioso, es un espacio industrial. Ahí se ve la habilidad con que se soluciona la bajada de aguas, ¿no? Cómo llegaba, cómo se recuperaba todo el agua, se sigue recuperando, lo tienen muy bien mantenido en la Bacardi, es un edificio fantástico. El tren de embotellado cada vez es más eficiente, cada vez es más pequeño y cada vez se embotellan más por minuto, no sé cuántos miles salen diariamente. Y bueno, lo interesante es que estas dos obras de arte de la arquitectura mundial, ¿no? Están muy cerca una de la otra. Este es el de Mies que ya vimos, pero al final de cuentas hay una especie de, yo le llamo que si son vecinos incómodos, porque Félix Candela había escrito mucho criticando a los arquitectos modernos que usaban cubiertas planas. Y había criticado mucho, sobre todo a Le Corbusier y a Mies van der Rohe, y hay una parte que escribió en una conferencia que se llamó El Cascarón como delimitador de espacio, que después se publicó en 1954, donde decía: seguimos obstinados en construir cascarones cúbicos. Si ello puede ser justificable en edificios de pisos, evidentemente los entrepisos tienen que ser planos, en los que la economía de altura y consideraciones funcionales nos obligan a recurrir a la losa plana, no ocurre lo mismo cuando se trata de cubrir grandes espacios, como en el salón de convenciones propuestos para Chicago por Mies van der Rohe, que prácticamente sería un reflejo del que hizo en México. La sola mención de este nombre nos lleva a la primera de las causas que nos proponemos investigar, las convicciones clásicas más o menos conscientes de la mayoría de los proyectistas. Hizo una crítica muy fuerte a los arquitectos racionalistas, digamos, decían que no era más que arquitectura griega puesta al día. Bueno, con eso acabo solo mostrando algo que ya mostró Allan, esta propuesta que había hecho Candela para la Bacardi de Puerto Rico, que no se construyó, y lo que sí construyó Enrique Gutiérrez, el arquitecto de SACMAC, de este grupo del cubano del que habíamos hablado, que efectivamente se exilió en Puerto Rico por ahí del año 62, y alrededor del 65 levantó esta cubierta. Esta fotografía la tomé hace 2 años que regresé a Puerto Rico y pude conocer a Enrique Gutiérrez y entrevistarlo. Fue muy interesante, ya muy mayor, 90 años, pero pues con una mente clara y lúcida, ¿no? Creo que a partir de aquí ya podemos seguir con el conversatorio, ¿no? Gracias.
¿Estudiantes tienen alguna pregunta? ¿O de los no tan estudiantes?
Bacardi was based in Cuba. What happened after the Cold War with the Bacardi headquarters?
Do you mean the Mies van der Rohe headquarters that were projected, or the actual headquarters? The actual headquarters moved first, as far as I know, to Bahamas and then to Bermuda, where the corporate headquarters are still today. Although, I would make the argument that Bacardi isn't organized as a company with one large central headquarters, but that in fact there are many headquarters, many operations, many facilities that each function in a way as a headquarters. The one in Miami, for instance, in Coral Gables, is quite a large facility, and I'm not an expert on exactly which parts of the corporation are based there, but you could come away with the impression that that's a corporate headquarters for. It's a very large building. The one in Bermuda is actually a very small building, but I think it's the titular headquarters of the company.
Yes, exactly. Bermuda is now the headquarters of the company. It's now. Now Bermuda is the base of headquarters of the company in the building that we saw it.
¿Qué pasó con el edificio original? ¿Existe o el edificio original de Santiago de Cuba, el de La Palmera?
The building, the plant building that was built around the Palm, So that building still exists, and in fact there's one more addition to that building that I didn't show, which is, it's a very, very interesting addition, because you saw the courtyard that was left where the palm was. They built right up to the palm with another building, a very modern building with screens, persianas of different types that turned, and metal, steel and concrete persianas. And the palm tree went right through the persianas, that building is still there, and it's, I believe it's still a facility for making rum. But the palm tree is no longer there, so something's missing. Yeah. So I was thinking about, you know, we all touched on the sort of the inherent conflict between the Mis and the Candela in here in Mexico City. And I saw a new plan that I hadn't seen before through Bettina Cheto, that by Max Cheto, for a reinvention of the comedor, with glass facades that would have wrapped around, and I think perhaps bridged a little bit between, but it's quite poignant, these separations, especially because of the antagonism between the architects. And I'm wondering if, you know, do you understand it the same way? I mean, these conflicts, why is it that, why do you think Bacardi, and I have my own ideas, but I'm just curious to hear from you all, why do you think Bacardi would have commissioned two absolutely opposed architects to do one facility in such close relation?
Yo contestaré en español. Pues yo creo que tiene que ver con lo que tú comentaste en tu exposición, que no es que prefirieran un estilo o algo que les gustaba, ¿no? La arquitectura, y que buscaban edificios simbólicos, ¿no? Que tuvieran como presencia importante. Yo creo que en este caso sería fundamental entender, y eso creo que se podría rastrear en la correspondencia, lo que planteaba SACMAC, lo que planteaba el equipo de proyectistas original, ¿no? En qué momento, yo no sé si tú sabes, Salvador, si entraron en contacto con Mies, o si fue, evidentemente Mies tuvo que haber estado en contacto con ellos incluso para el proyecto de Santiago de Cuba, ¿no? Entonces no sé cuál sea esa relación. Y la otra parte que es muy interesante, lo que mandó Bettina, hay un proyecto de Max Cheto para los comedores, que me gustaría que, bueno, tenemos aquí una testigo de excepción, que es Martelena Campos Newman. Martelena es, bueno, cuñada de Enrique de la Mora, y ella sabe de anécdotas que tienen que ver con la relación de Enrique de la Mora con Pepín, ¿no? Con Pepín Bosch, no sé si era con Pepín Bosch su relación o con…
No, con Ernesto Roldán. Bueno, yo tengo anécdotas, es decir, independientemente de que luego fui cuñada del Pelón de la Mora, porque trabajé con él. Al trabajar con él, pues conocí a su hermano y ahí me casé. Pero primero fui dibujante del Pelón y colaboré con él en muchísimas ocasiones, y desde luego conocí muy bien a Félix Candela. Félix Candela para mí era un estructurista increíble, y aunado con López Carbona, que es un genio creativo y también estructurista, yo vi surgir la bóveda de la Bolsa de Valores, cómo se hizo y cómo llegó, cómo no sabían cómo construirla. Los Landa no quisieron construirla, los ingenieros no sabían cómo construirla. Entonces López Carmona conoció Cubierta Sala y le dijo al Pelón, el Pelón es Enrique de la Mora, y le dijo, yo ya vi unas gentes que las pueden hacer. Entonces llegó Félix Candela al despacho Y le dijo, ¿usted puede hacer esto? Claro que sí. Y se fue. Y entonces le dijo López Obrador, un momento, si usted la construye, me dice cómo se construye y por qué la construye así. Entonces el único cambio que hubo fueron los arcos exteriores, que fue, digamos, una aportación estructural. Posteriormente yo no tenía idea de todo lo que había hecho Candela antes con Bacardi, pero el presidente de Bacardi en México, que era Ernesto Robles León, era muy amigo de El Pelón y le pidió que hiciera las oficinas, pero El Pelón le gustaba hacer chistes. Entonces dijo que Robles León, había una película de Danny Kaye, creo, que se llamaba El delirio de grandeza. Entonces él dijo que Robles León era un delirio de grandeza hecho realidad. Entonces le dijo Ernesto, por ese chiste que me hiciste no te voy a dar las oficinas. Entonces fue cuando surgió Mies van der Rohe. Mies van der Rohe hizo el edificio y luego le preguntó El Pelón, oye, ¿cuánto te costó pagar los honorarios a Mies van der Rohe? Pues no me acuerdo cuántos miles de dólares. Y dijo, ay caray, qué caros chistes hago. Pero luego las bóvedas de las bodegas nunca se le menciona, pero El Pelón tuvo que ver con la unión entre las bóvedas, porque con todo cariño a Candela, era muy buen estructurista, pero las obras que hizo con un buen arquitecto fueron mejores. Es decir, la verdad, si vemos lo que hizo en Cuba con Bacardi, pues ¿dónde estaba el arquitecto? Entonces, aquí en Bacardi, tan El Pelón intervino en las cubiertas que yo lo llevaba todos los martes a supervisar la obra. Entonces nos quedábamos a comer ahí y los comedores que vieron con los paraguas, esos yo hice los interiores, yo soy arquitecta pero me he dedicado a interiores. Entonces comíamos ahí y un día le dice Robles León, oye Pelón, me hicieron un chiste buenísimo que tú no me hiciste, que el Bacardi lo inventaron en Cuba, se hace en México, pero a mí se me sube a la cabeza. Entonces se voltea El Pelón y dice, no le diga que también el chiste es mío, porque me quitan las bodegas. Entonces, esas son las anécdotas alrededor de Bacardi. Y otra de las cosas que vi es cómo Noll amuebló las oficinas. Yo ahorita que estaba viendo los planos, seguramente en los archivos de Noll hay plantas amuebladas, porque ellos hicieron el amueblado en aquel entonces. Bien, pues son anécdotas. Espero que las haya entendido, si no se las traducimos luego.
Bueno, la historia de Noll es muy interesante, de Noll de México, porque también Mies y Somers no creían que Noll México pudiera hacer muebles de suficiente calidad para amueblar las oficinas. Les hicieron muestras y Gene Somers, el proyectista de Bacardi, amuebló su propio comedor en Chicago con sillas Noll que compró en México, que le costaban la mitad, ¿no? ¿Las Barcelonas son mejor las mexicanas que las alemanas? No creo. ¿Tú crees? Bueno, muy bien. Son muy buenas, sin duda son muy buenas, pero… Okay.
Que les cuentes del trabajo cercano que tuvieron SACMAC y el trabajo y el despacho de Mies para hacer el diseño del edificio. O sea, todo el tiempo estuvieron mandándose cartas.
Bueno, SACMAC, los ingenieros puertorriqueños, digamos que el anteproyecto lo hace Mies y el ejecutivo lo hace SACMAC, el proyecto ejecutivo lo hace SACMAC. Y también es una historia muy, muy divertida porque hay una carta que le escribe cuando Mies está desarrollando el proyecto cubano, antes de la revolución y todo esto, ¿no? Se nota muy claramente en las cartas de Pepín Bosch a Mies cómo odiaba a Batista, el dictador anterior. Pobre Cuba, puros dictadores. Entonces, él le dice, cuando iba muy avanzado el proyecto cubano y se publica en Architectural Design y en Forum y en todos estos lugares, y ve el éxito que tiene José María Bosch con esta arquitectura de Mies, le dice que proyecte el edificio de oficinas de México. Y en una notita, en unas tarjetitas, le dice a Somers, por favor, ¿qué le parecería a Mies echarle un ojo al proyecto que están haciendo SACMAC? Las oficinas de México las estaban diseñando este equipo cubano, que le eche un ojo, por favor, que le haga cualquier modificación que quiera para que quede bien, y no tenemos que decir que es de Mies el edificio, ¿no? Entonces Somers le responde a Pepín que sí, que por supuesto Mies le eche un ojo, Mies quería decir el mismo Somers, y que le mandan una propuesta, que le manden la propuesta de SACMAC. Entonces SACMAC, en una carta, en el archivo del MoMA de Nueva York, ya no existen los proyectos originales de SACMAC para las oficinas de México, pero existe la memoria técnica. Entonces, en la memoria técnica hacen una descripción de un edificio de concreto muy parecido al de la Torre de Miami, que tiene murales de un muralista y tal. Somers y Mies reciben la propuesta, que sonaba una propuesta muy barroca, y por supuesto la desechan. Y en su lugar mandan la propuesta que se construye, ¿no? Cosas así eran las que decías que platicara. Okay.
I just wanted to add, because perhaps not in a historical note, but just in terms of the relations between these companies, I think SACMAG was the company that Bosch trusted always to
Absolutely.
deliver for Bacardi. So I think in one way or another, SACMAG was involved in every project. They were involved in either as project managers or as overseers of construction or as price estimators, or and in other cases they did the whole building. I think the rare case for me is the building in Miami that SACMAG designed as a headquarters, because it was really the most prominent building that SACMAG had ever built for Bosch. And I think it was that moment of post-revolutionary sort of returning to his friends and colleagues and close connections that allowed that project to happen. You're right, it had its origins in the Mexico project, but it took a different form in Miami because it became a tower. I think in Mexico it would have been a low-rise structure, much like the building that Mies did. So it was a moment, and I found this looking across Bacardi's work, looking across Bosch's interaction with different architects, that there were moments where Bosch had only confidence in his close colleagues, and other moments where he had only confidence, or design confidence, let's say, in the architects, in Mies van der Rohe, in Felix Candela, etc. By the end of Bosch's career in the 1970s, he was working only with a group of Cuban emigre architects, Rosich, Eduardo Aguirre, and Enrique Gutierrez. So this was his group, his core group. So I think it was also just a matter of trust, in a sense.
Yo quiero preguntarle a Allan sobre la exposición que hizo, porque Allan vino a México hace 4 años, 4 years, porque preparó una exposición sobre los edificios de Bacardi en el mundo. Me gustaría preguntarte, porque esa exposición estuvo en Miami y luego se presentó en algún otro lugar, y bueno, si hay posibilidades de que venga a México en algún momento.
Yeah, so actually what inspired the exhibition, what was at the base of the exhibition was that Bacardi had moved its headquarters from that Miami building into new headquarters in Coral Gables, and this was commissioned by the Coral Gables Museum as a way of celebrating Bacardi's presence now in that city. Yes, we would like very much to bring it to Mexico. We have 2 versions of it. We have a version that has original materials, And then we have a version of it that would be purely digital that could be mounted, and so we'd love to bring it here.
We're going to talk about bringing it to Mexico. Bueno, pues creo que con esto damos finalizada esta conferencia de Allan Shulman. Les agradecemos muchísimo su presencia y ya pueden ir a comer, porque es un poco tarde. Y le vamos a entregar a Allan, en nombre del director, un reconocimiento por la conferencia que nos vino a dar aquí en México. Muchísimas gracias. Thank you.